All right, how you guys doing, movie lovers? My name is Luis Martinez, and I'm a collaborator of the San Diego Latino Film Festival here in its 27th year, in a virtual edition this year, obviously. And this is a Q&A for the film that you may have just watched called José Lezama Lima Letters to Eloisa, which is a documentary directed by Adriana Bosch, who's going to join us here today in a second. And
Right.
hey, Adriana, how you doing today?
I'm good, Luis. Thank you for having me. I really, was very happy to participate in this documentary. Of course, I look forward to going over to San Diego and being with all of you. But, circumstances are what they are.
The thing that the filmmakers are missing out the most on is the Sabor Latino
They're
part of the
drinking. They're
festival.
drinking.
The free Stella, the free beers, and the parties. You know
I
what I mean?
know. I know. I mean, it's just but we're thank you for holding it virtual. I know that it is quite a task to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a and obviously, thank you for bringing and allowing us to screen your film virtually. I've been watching it. I watched a few parts over the last couple of days just in preparation for this. You said before we came on line that you had kind of done one of these for Boston Latino Film Festival this
Yes, the
morning.
Q&A. Yes, yes, I had with that was done with an expert on the writer on José Lezama Lima. So it had the content was a lot more about the literature and about the content of the film than the film itself, and it was quite enjoyable. Filmmakers, as you know, we always have a hell of a lot more to say, or we think we do,
Right.
than what we put on the screen. So it's like you push a button, So I'll try to keep it short and have a good time with you.
No, no, it's fine. We got all the time that we need. But I wanted to ask you about the festival run. How has the film been received? How many festivals have you been in so far? How's that been going for you?
Well, I've been now. This is my sixth festival. The first one was the Miami International Film Festival. We had an amazing reception. Of course, this is the film's hometown, and we actually tied for the Audience Achievement Award. Although this year they only gave one award, and it was to another film. So that was kind of a bit disappointing. But other than that, it's been an interesting time. I think festivals have narrowed the number of films they're handling because of the circumstances. And my only regret really is that this film was made in a sense, its emotional content was made to be shared. I think my vision of this film was to have a house full of people, a theater, and that they would share in the experience with one another and generate that wonderful ping ping repercussion of emotion that takes place in a social setting. But again, I'm really happy to have seen the film shown in as many festivals as cities as it has been shown, and now I'm waiting for the next round. There'll be a few more that I've applied to, and there'll be some others in 2020. For the 2020 season that because it premiered in March, so the cycle won't close until next spring. So that's the long answer to what could be.
No, I've always said that the two of the most gratifying experiences for any filmmaker are day one, shot one.
Right.
Because that's just like the feeling of all the pre-production work coming to
Yeah.
fruition, and then also sitting in the back of an audience and watching a crowd's reaction to what you're doing.
Oh yeah. It's yes, yes. And at the end of the film, if you have that sort of I usually hang in the front to the side. I go, I sort of walk the hallways and in the theaters, and you can, I like to have the audience behind me. I don't want to, kind of watch because then you get too anxious. But that sort of little moment between the time where the credit roll finishes and you just have a few moments there before the audience reaction really comes forth. And then it's priceless. I think we make a lot of sacrifices, particularly in documentaries. Documentaries take a lot of work and a lot of effort, and they're always, um, it's a difficult medium. It's a difficult medium, and to convey emotion, and you're always nervous that your film is only important to you. And once you have a wonderful reaction from the audience, it kind of, it rewards you for everything that you have done. And I, that's
For me, it's usually because we do a lot of comedies. It's laughing or
oh yeah, right.
having them laugh at the right time. As a documentarian, you're looking for more of
And
like
you're looking for applause, man.
you're looking for applause.
And you're looking for, in this case, what happened was, since the film premiered here in Miami, there were a lot of tears. I mean, there were people were really, really, the theater was, everybody was crying. And I think there was a mixture of nostalgia, of recognition, and just seeing it. I think, in a way, for all of us Latinos, I think that is true. I had the same sense when I premiered a film about Latin music in Puerto Rico, where there were lots of Puerto Ricans. There were Mark Anthony, there was India, there was, Ricky Martin. There were all of the Puerto Ricans that had made that fourth wave of that Latino wave in at the turn of the century. And were people, it was like the second coming. This recognition that comes from seeing yourself, your culture, your thing projected with the same attention to details and production values that you associate with other people, and I think it's a wonderful recognition for us, and a wonderful validation. And I live for that. I live to validate my culture. I live to validate Latino culture, and I live to validate the importance of storytelling. And when that's validated, it's just, there's no substitute.
All right, here's our founder here, Mr. Vantillo, says, "Thank you, Adriana, for showing your movie in San Diego."
Thank you very, very much for having this movie in the San Diego Film Festival. Absolutely.
There's a lot of there's obviously marked differences between narrative and documentary filmmaking. Obviously, in as much as if it's a documentary that's about an ongoing subject affecting your subjects as you document them,
Mhm.
there's a lot of recreations. There's a lot of footage. You made a lot of decisions, in the best way to tell the stories. One of the first ones that sort of stood out to me was the choice to have the letters recited in English.
Yes, yes.
What went into that? Is that to give it a broader audience, or what was your thought process there?
Well, yes, I think absolutely. And I also, it was to give it, there was so much Spanish already in the film because of his words, because of the interviewees, that I felt I had reached that tipping point where I was going to be a Spanish language film. And that would not cover a lot of the general audience, speak Spanish, I mean, English speaking, but also a lot of Latinos that are not, that are not Spanish speaking audience. I wanted my film to be an American film. And I mean, in a way, a Latino film, which
Right.
is ultimately an American film.
Right.
And so that's, I think, the decision was made in that direction. I wanted to universalize the film. I didn't want to be locked up in a little bit Cuban bubble, having a Cuban
Right.
leader, a Cuban actor. And I wanted to open it up. At the same time, I wanted a voice that, and this is always true for the choice I make when I have a narrator, or I want somebody that can authentically project our tone, our timbre, our way of rapping. There's a way in which we speak that, even though if it could be, not in my case, but in the case of many second, third generation Latinos, it is totally accentless. But there is always a quality, I think, to the voice and to the delivery that speaks Latino. And I always wanted to have that in my films, you know.
When
So
when you're making those decisions, weighing, how to tell the story to the audience, do you ever feel that a documentary, because I mean, for myself, a narrative film, there's a
Mhm.
time where you get the cut that it's just right. Is it ever finished for you? Because I'm assuming
Yeah.
if you had an extra 20 hours to edit, you'd take another extra 20 hours
No,
to
I
edit,
have
right?
another 20 hours to edit, and I'm going to use them. And it's I have to do this film is, as I call it, the festival version. There has to be now a PBS version that is going to be 8 minutes shorter and
Oh,
probably a little more TV-ish, a little less you have to in order to do that, there is going to be some compression, so there might have to be a little more. I don't want to see have too much narration. My original intention to have was to have a non-narrated film, but there was so much to explain around the figure that people didn't know, and about a piece of Cuban history that people were unfamiliar with. And so that kind of forced me to have to make some decisions that I hope don't come through as didactic, but in a way that needed to explain the context and explain what was happening around the story I was trying to tell, and also set up my character. I'm sorry, I have some here. Set up my character in a way that familiarized you with him and his literature, because part of what the documentary tells you is that he was obscured as a writer. He was a writer that was a very famous, very well known, and then because of political issues and the way the course of history, the course that history took, was obscure, and I needed to drag him out of that relative obscurity, and bring him to the audience. So that created that created an issue. You say you're going to make a film about Garcia Marquez. You already have a lot of assumptions that the audience brings onto the film and knowledge, and you can work with that. When you do a film about José Lezama Lima, whose literary stature maybe is not as high, but pretty much in the same pantheon as a Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you don't know anything about him, that puts extra weight on the film to explain who he was, what he did, what his contribution was, and a lot of that information.
I think that, obviously, I'm Colombian, so you grow up and like you said, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is this giant figure, and then you're like, well, what are the quintessential Latino books that you should read, and
Yeah,
like the great works. So you have like Cien años de soledad, Martín Fierro, Paradiso. There's a
right.
lot of the book in sort of like this thought of knowing that it's out there in the ether and that it's an important piece of work. But this film really puts it into context, not only in how important he was as but how his life went from being celebrated to hidden, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And I think it's in its essence, it's a Cuban story, but it isn't. I mean, it's a story, I think, that you can draw out to a lot of writers and a lot of places where politics and literature mesh. And I think that you are a Colombian, I am a Cuban. I think we all know that we have governments from the right and from the left that for whom culture and literature and what people of that stature say becomes very important, because we value our literary figures are public figures. Our literary figures are not kind of novelists. We have a connection between literature and politics that is very strong. So it is important for a lot of these governments, especially if they tend to be totalitarian, or revolutionary, however you want to call it, that where they need the voices of these writers for legitimacy, not only for themselves, but abroad. And I think our writers, our intellectuals, have a weight in society that I think it's not something that you see as much certainly not in the United States. You may see it in French culture when you have the Jean-Paul Sartres and and people like that that become cultural icons, but and have great political influence. But for us, as when Garcia Marquez spoke, when Vargas Llosa spoke, Carlos Fuente, you name them, and they Jorge Luis Borges, our literary figures are enormous and enormously influential with people.
I think also, just if you look at somebody like a Hunter Thompson or a Walt
Mhm.
Whitman, these writers that are
Right,
American that get to tell their story, they get to basically speak freely, have these very poetic ways of talking about mundane situations in real life, but they never had the issue of a government, their own government, trying to basically erase them from the libraries.
right.
You know, so like you said, Latin writers don't have that. They have the freedom at a time, but in the same way, they also have, like you said, this weight behind them, and that's kind of hovering over them.
Right, and I think that you have a lot of this is more present in Russian history, in the history of not just the Soviet Union but Russian letters, and you have that kind of history of writers being erased from the public eye, or that tension between intellectuals and government. Art and politics is very present in a lot of cultures, not in American culture as much. But I'm not saying that it is absent, but you don't writers don't occupy the public square, if you may, the way that they do in our culture. I mean, our writers, governments need the support of these
Of the
intellectuals, and they're either in the opposition or they are asked, I think, by people to take a stance. And rarely do you have somebody like José Lezama Lima, who basically tried desperately to step away from taking a political stand, but politics came at him, and in the end, that was not possible. What he wanted to do, which was stand above politics and construct whatever it is he wanted to construct, a nation based on culture and literature and art, divorced from the politics of Cuba, was not possible. After the revolution, when everything became, was either, and Castro said it, against the revolution, there is no freedom, there is nothing.
I
And
know that I know that you've done previously a documentary about or story about Fidel Castro as well.
yeah.
Did did you, when you knew you wanted to tell stories, be a filmmaker, have this story as something that you knew you eventually wanted to tell, or was it something that came to you, after you've already been making movies for a while?
Well, I started my movie career, my documentary career, as an academic. I was an editorial consultant on a film about Central America, and then on a film about Mexico, and then on a film about Latin America, on a series about Latin America. And eventually I drifted into production because I felt documentaries had a way to convey very complex realities and very complex human emotions in a way that books didn't, in and could reach a lot more people that than you would in a book. And certainly academic articles and all that are very important and sustain the work of documentarians. But the idea of having a human voice, of having a human experience, of having somebody there has no. I think, as a picture is worth a thousand words. And so no, so that's where I started. And so I always began with an emphasis and a focus on Latin American stories, not just Cuban stories, but Latin American stories. And then I started working on Americans, on Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant, the Rockefeller, President Reagan, President Carter. I can give you, a huge amount of hours that I produced and directed and wrote, mostly for American Experience at WGBH. But quite frankly, I amazed myself at how much I would learn about American history, how important everything was, and how you I had the privilege, and I was given, of being able to penetrate this culture and to learn it, and to learn it from the ground up. And then somebody decided that they wanted me to do a show on Fidel Castro, and that presented a whole other set of challenges, because my distance shortened. I mean, I now it was more personal. There is no doubt that when I started working on films about Cuba, and when I started working on films about Latinos in Latin America, my commitment went much deeper. In terms, I felt that I had a personal responsibility, and to create some distance between myself and my passions, and at the same time deliver that passion in the work. And that is a very difficult piece. I With Castro, I tried to be as objective as I could. And in the end, I think the film was criticized by the left and by the right. So I felt that I mean, I was here in Miami, and my executive producer still calls that screening the lynching. So there was so much tension in the audience, and yet you know people began to write to American Experience saying how right wing that film was. So in a sense, that was to me the great success of that film, that I could get criticism from both sides. Um, when it came to, I think, my next truly heartfelt piece was Latinos. I don't know if you're familiar with the series that I did for WIDA in Washington,
Right.
Latino Americans. And there, I became so passionate about telling the story of Latinos in the United States. And the 2 hours that I did, actually three, I was series producer, and then I had responsibility for 2 hours and then another one. To me, it was so important that this series established the legitimacy of the Latino presence in the United States. I became obsessed with that. And the film and the first hour did that. And I would have to say that that was the thing I felt most passionately about in anything that I'd done. I identified completely with the loss that the Californios and the Nuevo Mexicanos, both native and Spanish, suffered with the expansion of the United States and with Manifest Destiny. I identified completely with the lack of acknowledgement that the enormous contribution that Latinos made to the building of Texas and the building of Los Angeles ended up, how that was not never truly fully recognized. And there I found it very hard to to maintain that distance, because here was something that was vital and that was urgent, and I really felt that we were doing something that needed to be done.
When you're getting that close to a subject matter, do you ever need to take a step back and sort of look at the project with fresh eyes, or how do you handle that?
Oh, you always do. You if you have the time to do it, you let some time go by. Generally, you don't. It's it is you always wish, I think I always wish I would go back to my films and redo some of the things in later, but usually you're under such time pressure that particularly when you're working on these high budget movies for a television station, where the clock is ticking and your editor is on overtime, and the archive is costing you 90 minutes a second, $90 a second. And so you have to surrender sometimes to those pressures. But in terms of Lezama and in terms of Latinos too, I think what I do to get some distance is you always, if you're a responsible filmmaker, you always make an effort at least to listen and to learn what the other side of the story is. And then you make a decision whether you're going to incorporate that or not, and whether that is in a valid argument that needs to be incorporated into your story. Otherwise, you're not being true to history. So, as a filmmaker, and I know this is not straight to your question, but as a filmmaker, I think as a documentary filmmaker, you're always caught between the truth and objectivity. You want to be objective, but you also want to tell the truth. And sometimes the voices that will give you objectivity, they're not telling the truth. And how do you make that choice? How do you then balance, quote unquote, a film having somebody that's telling you, oh, Latinos really, the ones that came where, where they had no legitimacy anyway, so they were wiped out, and so who cares? How do you incorporate that point of view without without damaging the fundamental truth that you're trying to tell, which is a great injustice was committed here, and that's what I want to talk about.
When you, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to
Yeah,
cut you off.
but so that is, I think, in some ways, and I'm sure every documentary producer, every documentary filmmaker probably faces that choice at some point. I take it very seriously.
Do you have voices outside of your inner production circle that you trust? As in, like, if you're doing rough edits of a
Yeah.
of a project, where you send it out to them to try to see if they feel like there's a slant one way or another.
Yes, yes. You always put together a board of advisors. I think that if you're conscientious, you include in that board of advisors people who do not think exactly alike. And so they will tell you you've gone too far in this direction, too far in the other direction. Ultimately, I have never worked without an executive producer. Sandy Pedlow from Latino Public Broadcasting was my executive producer this time, and she was rigorous. She was not only rigorous in terms of the projection of the film, the content of the film, but she was also very invested in that it become accessible. And I think that was, where she pressured me the most, is to make the film accessible to as many people as I could, because in the end, you know so much about a subject that you begin to forget how people are not going to understand you unless you really break it down for them.
Build
And
it up for them. Tell
yeah,
them the story.
yeah, yeah.
Dimitri says, "What an amazing experience! Thanks for watching the stream, Dimitri."
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
and then my next, I don't know, we're going to try to keep this short, but how much time do you spend? Because I can imagine, in terms of like a documentary like this, where it's both recreated footage, letters, voiceovers, and stuff. How long is your first cut, and do you trust an editor to just take chunks of footage and get rid of it, and then you trust that
Oh,
when you see
no.
it, or how involved on you're in the editing
Oh my
process?
God, I'm horrible. You can ask me. I am famous. I'm horrible. I sit with an editor. Basically, I give them a cut. I mean, sometimes I fake, or sometimes it's true that I give them options. Sometimes you give them options because ultimately you don't know best. You might think you know better, but you really don't know best. And an editor brings something to a film that helps you see things in a different way. But no, I make a paper cut, and usually what I do is I give editors a lot more leeway in the choice of images,
Mhm.
and in the choice of um
So
you,
you work the opposite way. You give them the rough cut and let them smooth it out for you, right?
no, I give them a paper cut, and then I sit
Okay.
next to them and I give them
Oh
selection. For
wow.
example, I will write a script, and within that script there might be a sequence that has 12 choices of takes. Out of those 12 choices you end up with three, and their input comes in that first cut, I direct the edit. I think documentaries are really, basically this type of history documentaries
No.
are made in the edit room a lot because the choices can be infinite. What do you include? What do you leave behind? What do you leave out? How do you go from one sequence to the other? The architecture of a film can be very complex. Where do you start? I mean, your first decision is, where do I start this film? In the case of Lezama, of Letters to Eloisa, the decision was, very clear to me. I had to start at a moment where you knew that his sister had left Cuba and that he was very hurt. And then immediately kind of tell the audience, well, why did she leave? And so um, in some ways that moment of departure means a lot for your film. In another film I might have started in the middle of the story where when he gets in trouble politically, but I thought since this was about letters, I needed to know who was the person to whom he was writing these letters, and what was his relationship to her, and what did it mean that she left, and also to get his to get a sense of his poetry and his writing into the film right away. So that first sequence where she walks away and he's relating to her in a letter a dream his mother has contains an enormous amount of information that kind of sets up a lot of what's going to happen in the film. You know a lot just from watching that. Um, Editors then become very important. I think that as you move on, you walk away from the edit room, you let them work on what you're doing. Depends on the editor. Some editors are stronger, other editors are not. One of my two editors was quite strong. The other one was a great editor, but wasn't really as strong. The Then you need to rely on, for example, when you put together those recreation sequences of
Right. I was about to ask you, yeah, like how do you mix those?
that's an editor's job.
Right.
I could put together, I went with my director of recreations, Maria Bures, my great cinematographer, Tim Crack, whom I brought from London, and to do this and so the images were there, the story was there, but then I needed a superb editor to be able to make those choices and pull it together, continuity, pace, all those things then come to bear into the filmic and artistic elements of a documentary. So, depends on the documentary, depends on what
And
you.
so I know I have trouble letting go and
Oh
trusting
man,
editing
I know we all do.
um
But documentaries, you see, it's easier when you're making a narrative film because you made a lot of the decisions prior
yeah,
to
yeah.
your production, and when you go into the edit room, you already have a clear sense of what you're going to end up with. In documentaries, you just have too many choices. Too many choices.
No, as I always say, you direct a movie 40 times. Once when you write it, once when we shoot it, and then the 38 times that you re-edit it
And
at
then
the
you
end.
re-edit it. Yeah, yeah. No, I know. Well, but we love it, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing, yeah, like
No, right.
there's nothing like a fresh timeline laid out, and you just start making your cuts and
Oh,
finding how things cut together, and just replaying something back and being like, oh God, I love how that changes. There's nothing.
and
It's
then
like a
somebody looks at it and said, "Oh,
like why'd you use that shot? Um,
why you do that?" And
why'd you do that there? It's usually because I had to. I had no other options, honestly.
well,
Um, when you when obviously the subject is, he's a an icon of obviously literature, but the fact that you tell the story in the form of letters also seems like an important choice, because when's the last time somebody wrote somebody a letter? It's also a throwback to an older time when nowadays it would have been long text to his sister, right? It would have been
Right.
something like, "My sister just sent me a long ass Snapchat." Like, is there something to
Yeah,
that as
but
well?
yes, yes, it's something wonderful. I think letters are unique, and they've been literary. In literature, they are
It's
literary.
where we get a lot of our history from.
That's right. And once you have, that's what brought me to this subject. I came from the letters to the subject. The first thing that I saw was the letters, and I thought, oh my God, what an incredible opportunity to tell a slice of Cuban history, and at the same time, really literally a slice of Cuban history. As I got deeper and deeper into the letters, then I said, oh man, this is a story about a writer who's overwhelmed by history. And this is much deeper than I thought to begin with. This is universal. And so that made me even double down on the idea of the letters. Um, but I mean, I think people forget that for a long time we had nothing, that we had telephone conversations that were lost. We had no emails. We had no Snapchat chat. We had no messages. We had nothing. And all we could hope for is that somebody had recorded something. Now we have a record. We can make documentaries. I think we're back into it, the age of people are writing a lot. I have nephews. I have two nephews. One is 22, one is 28. And they're incredibly literate because they have to write every day. They have to write emails. They have to write texts. They don't make grammatical mistakes. They have to look at the writing, and I think ultimately this proliferation of writing that we have may not be the same type of writing, but we do have. Look, when they do these investigations now, they take out somebody's drive. All the emails are there, so
Yeah.
you can trace a story via those emails, and I think people pay attention
I
to
think
to how they communicate. So I think we have kind of in a different way a resurgence of writing as an element in storytelling.
I think also, like, when a lot of people, when text messaging started becoming popular, were saying like, "Oh, why are we going backwards? Why would we go backwards from being able to talk to somebody on a cell phone to now I'm
Right.
having the same conversation but typing?" But I think it's a little much ado about nothing, really, because it's still communication. It's still reaching out.
Yeah, yeah. It's just it's always there. I mean, you can always rescue a text, and if you don't, so it's somewhere. I mean, we have this idea that there is a cloud out there. No, no, no. There isn't a cloud. There is a big server somewhere.
Yeah, it's just
You know,
it's just yeah, it's yeah, all your info there.
it's
All right.
just, and you don't see it.
That's why it's a cloud. Okay, so I just have a couple more questions for you, Adriana, and then I'll let you go.
Listen, I'm really happy that we're talking about process here. I love process. I think
okay.
process is so important, and
Well, I'm a narrative filmmaker. I always say that in my production company, we don't necessarily make important films, but we make comedies and stuff like that. And I think it's important to let people laugh sometimes.
yeah.
But my long term goal as a filmmaker at some point is to do some long form documentaries about subjects that are important to me. I just, it's just, time and a place. At some point, I'll get to it. So I love having conversations with filmmakers
Well,
about processes.
the first thing you have to have is a great story,
Yeah.
and you know it the minute you see it. If you become committed to a story the minute you see it, I mean, stick to it because people think there's a lot of great stories to tell, and maybe at times there are, but then at other times, you know, there may not be as great as you think they are, especially if you need to do a long form documentary. Your story has to have legs, and that's why if you have if you have a story, one of the most timeline documentaries are terrific. The documentaries long, that follow a character 2 to 3 years. Give yourself some time to let that story develop, and even if it's a story that is mostly in flashback, this person is likely going to change when you're telling their story. And I think that personal transformation that verite captures within the time frame of that a film is shot always finds gives you nuance and um, gives you a real human sense of how people change and people change their minds, and we need to accommodate that. And comedy, we always have to.
Uh, I
Anything,
always
man, if we don't laugh, we're screwed.
Absolutely. I always felt that you needed to take more care in making a documentary because if it's something about that's ongoing, I always felt like, well, there's this theory that once you start documenting something, you immediately change how it would be responding to normal day to day things.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to be careful with that. Also think, do you
Well,
agree that
you inject yourself in the story, and your
right?
presence in the story will change it.
For up and coming or for people that want to get into filmmaking, do you think that short form documentaries about things around them that are interesting to them is a
I
good entryway?
I think it's wonderful. I think that if you have a story that you can tell in 12, 14 minutes, go ahead. Tell it in 12 to 14 minutes. And then if the story works and you think you've left a lot out, then build it up and make it bigger. But don't pass up on a story that's around you because it's not an hour or huge, and if your means, if you have a short budget and if you have another job, and this is what you can do it. Absolutely do it. I've seen stuff done in 12, 14 minutes that's magnificent. And every story has a lens, and every lens is capable of drawing out of the story something magnificent. And you don't want to bore your audience. You want to, if you have a story that's 5 hours long, then maybe you have an hour documentary. And
Right.
and so yes, I absolutely encourage short form. Short form is great.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And do you happen to know about back to the letters, if he still has family that is in Cuba, out of Cuba, where's the rest of his family now?
Oh, his family is here. His sister died. uh I am in touch with his nephews and nieces, and and grandnieces. I speak with them all the time. I wanted to be kind of, what can I tell you? I wanted to be I wanted to keep it tight. I wanted to keep it to the two of them, and I wanted to keep it to him. And I wanted to keep her, and that's another reason why that scene is at the open of the film. I wanted to keep her, in a sense, fresh in his own mind as that beautiful sister that left and that he remembers, and not let her become somebody else in reality while he dreamt of her as she was. So I wanted to keep the fantasy, in a sense, of Eloisa present and alive in his letter writing. And then at the end of the film, if you see, when we see her only at the end, when she comes out in the 80s after his death, and she all of a sudden, oh my God, here she is in flesh, in reality. This is the real Eloisa. Meanwhile, she is this, the image of her is, I think, what's important for him. And so I did an interview with his nephew. I didn't use it. And I had actually met Eloisa, and I spoke with her extensively before she died. If she had been alive when this film finally, when I finally started shooting, I might have interviewed her, and then the film would have become a very different film.
Yeah, it would have been incredibly
Very,
different.
very different film. And frankly, that her letters are not of it. Her letters are lost, or at least lost to us. I have not discovered them. She collected the letters that he wrote her, knowing that they were of enormous literary value and historical significance, and donated them to the University of Miami. library, and where they've been, preserved and digitized, and they're now preserved. Um, but the letters from her to him are gone, and God knows if I probably would have had to interview her, and again, it would have been a very difficult film, and I wanted to keep, I wanted to. You're a narrative filmmaker.
It
You
would
you want to keep fantasies. You want to keep secrets. You want
no,
to.
it would have been more like educational, like scientific than more like,
Yeah,
ephemeral, more like a
yeah, like
feeling,
ephemeral. Beautiful. That you you hit that nail on the head.
Yeah.
It created this ephemeral and poetic vision of their relationship. I mean, it was these are love letters, and he was writing love letters to this beautiful woman, and so that's, and that is true for every love letter. 20, 30 years later,
Yeah.
yeah,
What have you been? How have you been keeping yourself busy during the lockdown? Doing a lot of these? Have you been planning your next project? What have you been doing?
I'm sort of thinking about my next project. I don't have anything locked yet, and staying healthy. I moved in with my mother. Excuse me.
Salud, salud.
During the pandemic, so I've been swimming a lot. I've been moving the film, trying to get the film into festivals and trying to get it distributed. I haven't really, that hasn't been so easy. It's still sort of, I'm still taking baby steps in that, um, and mostly thinking about what to do next. I need to start a new story. I have some ideas, but I don't have anything yet that's gelled enough that one of the things that we wanted to talk about, a film that I had on in mind, was doing something on Miami in 1980 that unites the McDuffie riots, um, the Mariel boat lift, and the anti-bilingual ordinances that were all coming at the same time in Miami. 1980 was a siege change. But then this wonderful filmmaker, local filmmaker, made a film called Liberty Burning, about the McDuffie riots. So I kind of step off that, and I'm letting some time go, and so that I can make a film that is not a repetition of his film, and maybe do something that you know is more digested through history and through years. So we'll see what happens.
Okay, and then last thing I wanted to ask you, just in the topic of the film, would be, I know you sort of alluded to it a little bit, but how has the perception of Zama been in Cuba and in southern Florida now? Is he kind of back to a status that he was, before everything happened to him, or how do you feel the perception of him is changing now?
Oh, I think Lezama, Lezama remained an icon of an entire generation of Cubans. I think that Lezama arrived full force in exile in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift, because there was a lot of young men there, and a lot of them gay, and writers, and who basically still thought of him as an icon. And the first literary journal of that generation, was dedicated to José Lezama Lima. So in a sense, what brought Lezama Lima to exile. Reinaldo Arenas was a devoted follower of José Lezama Lima. He's the protagonist of the Schnabel film, Before Night Falls,
Right.
and Lezama also became internationally famous. Paradiso was translated into every conceivable language, and he became kind of a canonic. He really did take his place in the pantheon of that Latin American boom, thanks to critics, thanks to the other writers of the boom, who basically made sure that his work got the attention that it needed. And then in Cuba, when the 90s rolled around, I think the government began to reconsider a lot of what had been done in the 70s and the 80s, and an opening, a flowering of culture, of literature and everything, began to take place, and the rescue of Jose Lezama Lima began to take place. They decided that Jose Lezama Lima, they decided to publish Paradiso again. They made him a museum. They transformed his house into a museum. He became the subject of multiple. I mean, there is a proliferation of Lezama writings now. Everywhere you turn, somebody's writing about Lezama, both in the United States and also in Cuba. And would Lezama? I think the key question that I ask myself about this is, and I struggle with this in the film, how much credit, how much emphasis to place on the rescue of Jose Lezama Lima. And I felt in the end that number one, you cannot erase what's been done to a human being. I mean, he died and he was miserable, and he had a horrible time and he suffered oppression, and he suffered loneliness, and he, and he basically died in a terrible, terrible place. And at the same time, um, you can restore his place in history fully, because if you think of the Latin American boom as a media event, which it was, because all these writers were writing about the same time, and all this attention was poured onto them, and Lezama wasn't there. To try to bring him from obscurity and put him back in there is not quite the same. It's not quite the same. So I think it will always remain in some obscurity because of this. People become, your moment is your moment. And if you don't shine when it's your moment, it's going to be very, very hard to restore you to the place that you would have occupied then. So I think this is there's some there's some things that cannot be recovered in this rescue of Jose Lezama Lima. At the same time, I applaud the fact that he is back as part of the Cuban as a key central, probably the most salient intellectual figure of the 20th century in Cuban literature. And he has been he has that place one more time, and I think as a reference point in literature, both in Cuba and Latin America, there is no doubt that has been important. And of course, the Cuban government gave him some popular exposure when the that film, Strawberry and Chocolate, that was made in the 1990s, had Lezama Lima as sort of his offstage protagonist, off-screen protagonist. When around the issue of homosexuality, and he has become sort of a homosexual icon as well. And I think that a gay icon, and I think that's very, very good
Well,
because
if you didn't get a chance to watch the movie, it is playing again next Sunday, the 27th at 2:30 p.m. So you guys have one more chance to watch Jose Lesma Lima, Letters to Eloisa, an incredible documentary. Thank you very much, Adriana, for taking the time to do the Q&A with me today. Uh, any last words for us or for the people that what you want them to take out of watching your film?
Well, I want to thank you, Luis, for taking this time. I have enjoyed this conversation tremendously, and I want people to walk away from this film with an understanding of how important it is to preserve our freedoms, and I don't mean in the sense of that that's being interpreted today, but our true freedoms, and to make sure that the rule of law, that institutions, that all of those things that protect people are respected and cherished, and that we don't ever take them for granted, because when they can really hurt when they're not.
Yeah, absolutely.
People really get hurt when you have you know um, governments that don't respect the rule of law and don't respect constitutional limits, and think that they can shut people down, and play with the truth in ways that they should not. At the same time, I think we need to protect freedom of speech as much as we can. Um, so on both ends, I think we need to be careful how we deal with this precious, precious, precious thing that is freedom, that is speech, that is literature, and I like that to be the take home point of this.
So go watch the documentary, get excited about it, and then get up and take some action, right?
Well, vote, vote, vote.
Thank you, Adriana.
Whatever it is that you vote, vote. All right.
Uh, all right,
Thank
guys. Thank you
you.
for watching. You can watch the movie again next Sunday. We were supposed to do 30 minutes. We did an hour, but it felt like nothing. So thank you very much, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I didn't get to meet you in person. I would have had a lovely time.
Oh, I'll reach out to you later. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye bye. Thank you.